We are going to create a pivot table based on invoices and memos. So go to your screen ID and drill down to your invoices and memos. In the name box, we're going to give a name to the pivot table. I'm going to call it Invoice Totals by Customer. We can now save. As you can see in the pivot table ID, the name that we've typed in has been used to create an ID for the pivot table. Let's now add fields to the pivot table as follows. Drag the customer field into the rows pane. The names of customers will be displayed as row headers in the pivot table. When looking at the properties of the customer field on your right-hand side, ensure that Show Total is ticked. The system will display the total column with a cumulative all-year-round total for each customer. Now look for the date field and drag it to the columns pane. When you stand on the date field, the properties for that field will display on the right. Ensure again that your Show Total is ticked. This will ensure that the system adds the total column, where a total for all dates in each row will be displayed. In the Round 2 box, let's have a look at the options. We are going to select for this example, quarters. By selecting quarters, the system will aggregate invoice totals by quarter. Now we are going to look for the total amount and drag it to the values pane. The pivot table will display invoice amounts aggregated by quarter for each customer. Now let's save our changes and let's view the result. The pivot table is opening up in a separate tab. The pivot table you have created is available only to you. You can, however, share a pivot table with other users of Acumatica ERP through setting access rights. Let's close our pivot table. In the next step, we will configure a structure for the column headers to make the table more convenient for analysis. For date fields and fields with segmented identifiers, such as item classes, you can configure the structure of column headers to make it more convenient for users to understand. We are now going to set up a 2-level column header for the invoice totals by customer pivot table. We are now going to add another date field to the columns pane. Select the first copy of the date and go to the Properties pane. Ensure that your Show Total is ticked. And let's change Round 2 to years. The system will display the total column with a cumulative all-year total for each customer. Now let's go to the second date line. In your properties, ensure that Show Total is selected. And in the Round 2, let's select quarters. The system will display the total column after the Q4 column for each year. Now let's save our changes and let's view our pivot. As you can see, the column headers have been divided into 2 levels. The first level displays years and the second level displays quarters. The total column is displayed after each year. And when you go to the far right, you will see a total column which sums up all years. Let's close our tab and go back to the pivot table screen. We are now going to revert back to the previous version just to make our next step easier. So go to the second date field on your columns pane and click the lead row. In the Round 2 setting on your properties, select quarters and let's save our changes. We've now returned the plain headers back to simplify our next step. We are now going to filter the data in the pivot table by using a shared filter. When the pivot table contains a lot of data, it can be difficult for users to analyze the data. To reduce the amount of data in the table, you can use shared reusable filters created for a generic inquiry whose data the pivot table displays. By using a shared filter, you can filter data in the pivot table permanently. The filter actually is applied to the generic inquiry, and then the pivot table uses the filtered data. Users will need to have access rights to the pivot table's form in order to apply these shared filters. We are going to apply the current year filter, which has been created in a previous lesson on filters, to the pivot table. On the pivot table's form, we will look at the invoice totals by customer pivot table. In the shared filter to apply drop-down, you can now select shared filters that is available. We're going to look at current year. Select the filter and save. Let's view the pivot table. You can see that the table now contains data only for the current year. Let's close the tab. Let's change the filter back to all records. Save, and let's view the pivot again. Now we have our full quarterly view again. Let's close the tab. The next step that we're going to look at is sharing a pivot table. If you would like to share your pivot table with other users in the workspace, we will show you how to do that. Firstly, you'll need to select a sitemap location. In this case, we want the pivot table as part of accounts receivable in the Reports section under Audit, and let's save. To add the pivot table to a workplace, do the following. In the main menu under Receivables, go to the ellipses at the left-hand corner, Edit Menu. We are now going to add a menu item. Start by typing the name of your pivot table, then you can tick the checkbox, Add and Close. You will now see the pivot table displayed, and if you select the checkbox next to it, it will also be added to your Quick menu. Exit Menu Editing, and there you can see on your menu your pivot table, invoice totals by customer, also under your Quick menu. To restrict access to your pivot table, follow the guide on access to reports, generic inquiries, and pivot tables.